Good evening, everybody. We are back on Dialogues with another stimulating talk. And our speaker today is Dr. Prathama Banerjee from the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, or CSDS. Dr. Banerjee is a historian of modern South Asia and takes an interest in cultural history, literary studies, and political philosophy, broadly speaking. The title of her talk today is Kings, Jurists, Ascetics and Outcasts, Discontinuous Histories of Sovereignty in South Asia. In this talk, she would be sharing with us facets of her research into the deep history of sovereignty in South Asia, how deeply entrenched were notions of sovereignty in the region's past, what was the nature of the relationship between social and political authority, and how productive is it for the historian of South Asia to focus on the state and processes of state formation in any study of the South Asian past. These are some of the questions I'm told that Dr. Banerjee seeks to explore in today's talk. Before the talk begins, my colleague Dr. Nishan Choksi from the discipline of Humanities and Social Sciences will say a few words about Dr. Banerjee's research interests and scholarship. On behalf of the discipline of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Gandhinagar, I take this opportunity to thank you, Prathamadi, for agreeing to deliver a talk for Dialogues. I also thank the audience for joining us for this talk. Over to you, Nishant.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, I just want to, I think Madhumita just introduced the talk very well. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about Prathama Banerjee's work and, very in brief. And then I think we can go for the talk. So, So I've had a relationship with Prathama Banerjee for many years now, and she was on my dissertation committee. So I'm very happy to have her here. And I wish she could be here in person, but it's okay to be here. The web is a good substitute. So my first I encountered Prathama Banerjee through her first book, which was Politics of Time, which is Primitives in History Writing in a Colonial Society, which was published in Oxford in 2006. And I really thought it was a wonderful and really thought-provoking piece into this idea of temporal politics. It was focused on colonial history, but even for me as an anthropologist, I really, I found it very important at how we sort of Bengali nationalist historians and even in ethnographic writing sought to cast the Santals as frozen temporally and like a sort of temporally backward or primitive or culturalize their practices in a historical or anthropological narrative. And she discusses this. One of the chapters, one of the parts of the book I really liked was her analysis of the Santal Hul, and the way that she looked at the texture of chronological or temporal understanding among the Santals, and the variability of it, and then how that was sort of cast by the Bhadralok historians in this both liberal and of the radical bent, as this event in the history of the nation. And then she looked at it through debts, markets, and migration also. And then her latest work was about, I think she's taken forward this idea of practice, the relationship of practice and conceptual understanding in her latest work on the idea of the political and the genealogy of the political. And I think that's really, and her book will be coming out soon in 2020, Elementary Aspects of the Political, Histories from the Global South, which will come out in December. And I'm looking forward to it. From the work that I know, for instance, how she looked at how the word karma, which was a field of practice in the pre-colonial usage, gets taken up, a field of action, and gets taken up as this idea of the political in different kind of thinkers. And then, she also looks at this sort of idea of the political and the social through this renunciation. And so really you trying to, in the writings of Vivekananda, so it's really the vernacular, looking at how vernacular comes into a concept. So I'm very excited to hear this latest work, and I welcome, thank you, Prathama Di, for coming, and appreciate it.
So should I launch into it?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Okay.
All
All right. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure, though virtually, to be meeting you all. And some of you were actually old friends. So it's wonderful. And I'm taking the pretext of old friendships to present to you something which is very kacha. It's new work that I'm just beginning to think of, in which, as a historian of modern times, I dare look at the ancient and medieval times and try to think of a long narrative of political thought in our part of the world. So it is, as you know, periodization is, walls are really high walls in the discipline of history. And I'm trying to leap over them. And I'm sure I'm going to make many mistakes, and which is why, I really am presenting this for you to give me feedback and frank criticism of how I can go wrong or how I am going wrong. So without further ado, let me just say what I have to say. All right. So in this presentation, I look back as a historian of modern times to the far past to explore the nature of rulership in India. For analytical purposes, I peg my inquiry to sovereignty, the by now global concept which we routinely use to characterize the state with its assumed monopoly of law and violence, and its defining prerogative of absolute freedom of policy and practice. Now, sovereignty is a concept with a medieval and early modern European provenance. It has a specific philosophical constitution having to do with the ruler's prerogative to institute law, declare exception, and dispense debt. In the European academy, the debate about the historicity of sovereign power continues to rage amongst highly influential philosophers. But I shall not restate here the well-known historicist argument against sovereignty, namely that sovereignty is a pre-modern political formation superseded in modernity by other forms of governance such as discipline and biopolitics. But nor shall I make the anti-historicist argument, which sees modern governmentality as already shot through with archaic forms of sacrificial and sovereign violence. It is not that I disagree with these arguments, but for the moment, I want to step outside the terms of this debate and make a different proposition. My proposition is that the term sovereignty does not quite capture the nature of political power in South Asia and most likely in many other parts of the world. In South Asia, the colonial state deployed the concept in 19th century, and in the name of the rule of law, governed the colonized through acts of exception and emergency, performing the classical model of sovereignty, as it were. With decolonization, states inherited the rhetoric of national sovereignty, in time naturalizing the concept across the world. If one looks back into history, however, it becomes clear that in South Asia, neither the state nor law were sovereign entities in the strict sense of the term. Historians of South Asia have registered this fact. They have debated whether other conceptual formulations, such as segmentary state, shared sovereignty, little kingdom, galactic polity, etc., work better to describe the dispersed and distributed nature of political power in South Asian history, given that here the substance and quality of kingship, even in the times of imperial formations, was shared between the paramount ruler and multiple other forms of landholding and self-governing entities: monasteries, temples, gods, Brahmins, guilds, clans, tribes, zamindars, talukdars, malguzars, and so on. Stateness, in other words, was not a transcendent form of power. Historians have also noted that in South Asia, the state was not the primary source of law. Law pre-existed the state. While the state was expected to dispense justice and punishment, it did so by the discriminatory application of community law, caste law, regional custom, doctrinal criteria, king's decree, and normative principles such as of reasonableness and fair play. State and law, in other words, did not form a tightly knit conceptual pair as is implied by the concept of sovereignty. And yet, we continue to use sovereignty as a generic term for political regimes everywhere in the world. Our point of departure remains the early modern absolutist state of Europe, an ideality which we then qualified post facto by bringing into play empirical modifications, hence shared, segmentary, theatrical, ritual, concentric, or for more recent times, incomplete and even failed sovereignty. Or, in the name of social history, that is the history of caste, class, race, gender, and religion, we focus on the apparently symmetrical other of the state, namely society, often to the deliberate exclusion of state and government. Discounting, for example, the fact that in South Asia, a deep history of caste cannot be written without including in the story the phenomena of Shudra kingships and untouchable and warrior communities. Either way, we unwittingly end up reinforcing the state versus society, or the social versus political binary of modern political thought that obscures, I believe, the actual operation of power in the long history of South Asia. So it seems to me that in South Asia, regimes of rule, and I deliberately use the phrase regimes of rule here as a substitute for the default term state. Regimes of rule were constituted by an irresolute dialectic between political power and social power, king and Brahmin, sultan and Sharia, state law and caste or community law, in a way that unsettles the classical definition of sovereignty as the exclusive right of the ruler to institute and suspend law. To understand the dynamic of political power here, therefore, we must attend to the social constitution as much as to the state, and see the king as one of the actors who partakes in as well as cuts through pre-existing social dynamics. I should clarify right away that when I use the term society here, for the lack of any other available term in English, I imply samaj, a term found in both Sanskrit and the Indian vernaculars, which I take to mean the horizon of possibility of sociability, and not a nation or a population unified, territorialized, and governmentalized by a state. For me, the term social does not denote the society of the modern state/society binary. Now, the South Asian social constitution, or Samaj, as we know, seeks to order individuals and communities into an eternal normative hierarchy of varnas, scholars, warriors, producers, and servants, legislate upon permissible forms and degrees of sociability between diverse jatis, according to parameters of proximity and distance, and define the boundary between society and those like forest peoples, untouchables, ascetics, foreigners, etc., who are posited as beyond the pale of society. Dharma, as elaborated in the textual genre of the Dharma Shastras, was a paradigm of diminishing political autonomy backed by social strictures, with the Brahmin at the top claiming immunity from taxes, capital punishment, and confiscation of property, almost a sovereign unto himself, and the Shudra at the very bottom relegated to servitude and by definition a non-sovereign. The Dharma Shastras, as we know, explained the empirical diversity of jatis as being the result of caste miscegenation, theoretically instituting the principle that the social order was basically a regime of degrees of permissible and prohibited sociability, involving the entire possible range of human interactivities, touch, sight, commensality, and sex, enforced by an elaborate jurisprudence of punishment, penance, and excommunication. In this framework, dharma was indeed law, but law immanent to society, with the king written into it as yet another social being, even though a preeminent one, subject to Kshatriya dharma and socially assigned rights and duties. Ambedkar pointed this out in the early 20th century in criticism of nationalists who valorized Indian society as the sovereign domain of national life and opposed colonial laws like the Age of Consent Bill, not in terms of a particular law's merits and demerits, but in terms of the colonial state's foreignness to Indian society. Ambedkar famously said that India was never a society in the first place, even if it might have been politically and culturally a nation. India was an agglomeration of castes and communities which operated like polities unto themselves, policing their borders and prohibiting intercaste and intercommunity sociability. Samaj, in other words, was a juridicalized formation, and proscription and punishment, often involving violence and humiliation, was a socially dispersed and socially contested prerogative. Needless to say, this historical reading of Samaj troubles the concept of sovereignty as a transcendent form of political and juridical power ascribable exclusively to the state. Following Ambedkar's formulation, I argue that rulership in South Asia was historically locked into an infinite dialectic without resolution or sublation, with a fundamentally juridicalized and potentially totalizing social constitution. Now, the semantic history of the term dharma, as told by Patrick Olivelle, is rather interesting. In the earliest texts available, such as the Vedas and the Brahmanas, dharma was invoked purely in association with royal power, both kingly and godly. Dharma being that which protected the weak from the strong. Eventually, however, dharma began to be claimed and consolidated as the domain of the Brahmin, the social legislator. The process was simultaneous to the rise of Buddhism and other ascetic philosophies in South Asia. Asceticism emphasized individual autonomy in place of social being, mobilized powerful anti-Brahmanical, though not always anti-caste rhetoric, and fed into the possibility of an autonomous and ascendant kingship, no longer dependent on the Brahmins' intercession with the gods via the mediation of the sacrifice. Not surprisingly, the Maurya kings, Shudras in Brahmanical reckoning, and the Mleccha, Saka, and Kushana rulers hailing from Central Asia turned to Buddhism as royal ideology. In other words, the king-Brahmin pact around the institution of the sacrifice began to unravel by the turn of the Common Era. This led to a long history of what has been called Brahmanical reaction, or the Brahmin king face-off, which, even though Brahmins often tried to incorporate elements of the ascetic disposition into the persona of the ideal Brahmin, we see through the centuries virulent Brahmanical rhetoric against wandering ascetics. Now, Dharmashastras proliferated and systematized over the centuries, consolidating the Brahmanical social constitution, and on rare occasions, leading to the direct deployment of Varna and Jati Dharma as royal ideology, as happened in the Maratha Peshwa regime of the 18th century, with the intention of making the political dispensation and the social constitution perfectly identical. Eventually, inter-community relationships would also be managed in the same Dharmashastric terms. Kumkum Chatterjee shows, for example, how in Bengal, Brahmins tightened controls on marriage and purified lineage histories around the 14th century to firm up the social boundary against the new Muslim ruling elite, even as they acquired Muslim patronage and eventually owned up to Persianate courtly culture in public life. Of course, the consolidation of the Dharmashastric social constitution did not go unchallenged. Its most trenchant critique, and this is my main point today, its most trenchant critique came in the form of what I call here, albeit somewhat provocatively, the anti-social perspective. I use the term anti-social to denote an individual or a community's self-presentation as being outside the pale of society. And by virtue of precisely that externality being a source of counter-Brahmanical power. Understood in this way, the antisocial becomes a capacious and complex heuristic category and includes diverse historical modes of being within it, of which, of course, the ascetic was the exemplar. Audrey Truschke, for instance, has recently documented the political clout of Jain ascetics in the 16th century Mughal court and their rivalry with Brahmins in the same court. But Brahmanical suspicion was not just reserved for Buddhist and Jain ascetics, but also extended to myriad others who we would today think of as belonging to the internal history of Hinduism. Take the Kapalikas, for example. Kapalikas, or skull men, worship the antisocial god Shiva Bhairava, who lived atop mountain Kailasha, far from human habitation, and socialized with ghosts, snakes, and bulls. The Kapalikas identified themselves by their begging bowls made out of human skulls, ash-smeared bodies, and their propensity to frequent cremation grounds and other frontier spaces. An early Dharmashastric text, the Yagyavalkya Smriti, uses the term Kapalika to denote Brahmin killers. In later texts, Kapalikas were mentioned as those who demonstrated to the great Shankaracharya, the founder of Advaita Vedanta, the aporia of his existential thinking, caught in the double bind between action and inaction, dualism and non-dualism. Gorakh Siddhanta, the founding text of the Nath Panthis of northern India, recently in news, because as we know, the ultra-Hindu Uttar Pradesh Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath claims to belong to this community. Gorakh Siddhanta said that Kapalikas cut off the heads of the avatars of Lord Vishnu to rid them of their pride and carried their skulls in their hands. The Nath yogis were known as adepts, and many of them hailed from low caste and untouchable communities, as evinced by names such as Dombi, Sabari, Tanti, Chamari, and so on. I cite the example of the Kapalikas to share the actual texture of what I call here the antisocial perspective, animated by troubling symbols like human skulls, dangerous spaces like cremation grounds and forests, and actual physical exclusion, untouchables, ascetics, tribals. The antisocial in this telling is not a liminal perspective in any generic sense. I believe it is a very particular orientation produced out of the constitutive aporia of the South Asian social constitution. The philosopher Sundar Sarukkai, in his essay, The Phenomenology of Untouchability, writes of the community of acharyas, the most superior of all Brahmins, who fashion themselves as untouchables. They acquire untouchability by birth. They cannot eat food cooked even by their wives. Even a dog cannot eat their leftovers, because what is food for them is poison for all else. The absolute superiority of the Acharya Brahmins, in other words, is understood as a function of their absolute unsociability. I understand this counterintuitive case of social being, the untouchable Brahmin, an oxymoron as it were, as a limit case, which exposes the constitutive aporia of dharma, the aporia being precisely that dharma is an imagination of society which is founded on the principle of absolute unsociability, of which untouchability is the paradigmatic instance, as it were. It is this aporia that produces, I think, the antisocial as a potentially powerful counter perspective in the history of political power in South Asia. So, apart from the exemplary ascetic, the antisocial included at various times A, armed warrior monks, such as the Nathpanthis I just mentioned, the Ramanandis, etc., whose popularity amongst low-caste peasants and whose resistance to 18th century colonial military pacification is well documented by the historian William Pinch. B, heterodox devotional communities whose literary productions rivaled the Brahmins in sophistication and popularity, and who contested caste hierarchy in the name of an unmediated relationship of affect with God, such as the much discussed Virasaiva movement of 12th century Karnataka, which went on to wield great influence in the Kalachuri court through the activities of the famous poet, saint, statesman Vasavanna, and whose other poet, Allama Prabhu, famously said, to cite the historian Manudeva Devan's translation, "God is dead, there is no God." C, Atavikas, variously called forest peoples, hunters, barbarians, and demons in early South Asian texts, shunned as fallen people, and yet sought out as the most desirable warrior allies by political thinkers from Kautilya to Ibn Khaldun. Historians, in fact, have documented kingships emerging from forest territories, such as the Bhils in central and western India and the Gajapatis, the lords of the elephant in Orissa. D, of course, Muslim or Mleccha rulers who were seen as irremediable foreigners, and yet who wielded enormous power in the very heart of the Brahmanical country of Aryavarta. E, Sufi Pirs and Ghazis, warrior saints and mystics, who were instrumental in spreading an egalitarian Islam and an ethos of industry and piety amongst peasants, for example, in Eastern Bengal, a process well discussed by Richard Eaton, and leading in the 1930s and 40s to a rare moment of untouchable Muslim alliance in anti-colonial peasant politics. And E, Antyavasi, literally the dwellers of the edges, mostly denoting untouchables and outcasts who were seen to frequent dangerous spaces like borders of settlements, cremation grounds, and again, forests. Now, much can be said about how each of these antisocial locations produced distinctive political and existential counter discourses to hegemonic notions of Brahmanical sociability. To keep the discussion brief, however, I focus on what I consider the most telling articulation of antisocial dispositions, namely the king ascetic untouchable complex. Here are a few examples. The 13th century text, Shunya Purana, ascribed to Ramai Pandit, spoke of the god Dhamma, who, angry with Brahmins for violently persecuting Buddhists, appeared on earth as a Muslim warrior and killed the Brahmins. Until as late as the early 20th century, Dhamma, alternately called Shunya or void, and iconized by an opaque black stone, was worshipped by untouchable domes in Bengal. The 16th century text, Lakshmi Purana, attributed to Balaram Das, belonging to a devotional tradition of self-proclaimed Shudra ascetics, spoke of Lakshmi, the goddess of plenty, assuming the form of an outcast Chandala woman to teach her husband, the great Lord Jagannatha, and his brother Balaram, a lesson in social equality. She forces them into penury and hunger till they end up eating at the hands of a real-life untouchable woman. Since then, untouchables and Brahmins eat together in the god's royal abode, the Jagannatha temple of Puri. The Shardula Karna Vadanam, a story anthologized in the Divya Vadana collection of early Buddhist legends, mention the learned Chandala king, Trishanku, who knows astrology better than Brahmins and fluently recites Rigvedic mantras. Buddha invokes Trishanku as an exemplar of righteous law in order to justify his own act of initiating a Chandala woman, Prakriti, into monastic life. Drawing from this early legend, Rabindranath Tagore retold the story of the Chandala woman Prakriti and the Buddhist monk Ananda in his dance drama Chandalika, first performed in Bengal in 1933. Notice how these stories of the far past leave traces in our times. Also notice how these stories pair the king and the untouchable together via the mediation of an ascetic voice, ascribed sometimes to low-caste renouncers, sometimes to Buddha himself, who, we must not forget, was himself an untouchable in some of his previous births, according to the stories of the Matanga Jataka and the Chitta Sambhuta Jataka, before he could be finally born as Siddhartha Gautama into a ruling Kshatriya lineage. Now, this brings me to the historian Declan Quigley's very controversial essay, Kingship and Untouchability. The Quigley posits the king and the untouchable as mirrors to each other. Both are ambiguously located vis-a-vis caste society, being simultaneously internal and external to it. Both tend to attract and absorb dosha, darkness, sin, corruption. The king, because calamities in his kingdom, like famine and flood, and the sins of his subjects ultimately stop at his door, and because he must undertake acts of violence, killing, and cruelty. The untouchable, because he must necessarily deal with the discharges of society, dead bodies, carcasses, dirt, and waste. Both are potentially threatening to the social constitution. Both pay the Brahmin priest to take on, via ritual mechanisms, pollution onto themselves, thus freeing the king and the untouchable to carry on with their assigned tasks. Which is why, in Quigley's telling, the Brahmin priest eventually acquires a relatively lower status amongst Brahmins themselves. In fact, Brahmins who refuse the priestly function and acquire properties of the classical ascetic come to be the most supreme Brahmin, socially dead, a preta or a spectre, as the Tamil scholar Srinivasa Ramanujam has recently argued. The king, the untouchable, the ascetic, and in response, the ideal Brahmin himself seeks to mobilize the antisocial location for purpose of political heft. Now, lest the king untouchable pairing appears to be merely an archaic fact, I cite here some contemporary ethnographies, which show modern day Dalits and tribals claiming the kingly prerogative. The first is Rosa Maria Perez's ethnography amongst the untouchable Vankars, Deds, and Meghawalas of Gujarat, who are called upon to make rain even today on the ground that traditionally, when the king failed in his royal task to ensure rain in his kingdom, untouchables had to be called upon to do it. The second is Kalpana Ram's ethnography of spirit possession amongst Dalit and tribal women of Tamil Nadu. These women, possessed by the spirits of the untimely dead, perform as royalty, holding court, hearing petitions from all castes, high and low, and pronouncing judgments in classical oratorical Tamil, which is not their everyday language of speech. The third is Aditya Pratap Deo's ethnography of the mixed tribe caste villages of Kankar, Chhattisgarh, where the idiom of kingship, he shows, continues to animate even after the formal abolition of princely states. Popular claims to self-governance mediated by gods and ancestors at the village and indeed the Pargana level. The Orientalist valorization of Brahmins as the repository of Hindu civilization, the colonial establishment of the Dharma Shastras as the primary source of Hindu law, the military pacification of warrior communities and low caste lordships 18th century onwards, and above all, the reformulation via population census and ethnographic survey of caste as purely a form of social demographics has emptied caste of political and kingly significance today. The late 19th, early 20th century phenomenon of low and middle castes wearing the sacred thread and claiming the status of Brahmins has taken our attention away from the much longer history of Shudras and Untouchables claiming warrior and kingly prerogatives. The stake in Kshatriyahood rather than Brahminhood and the cultivation of martial and lordly qualities, which was emphasized by Jyotiba Phule and invoked by many early 20th century Mahar activists in Bombay Presidency, cannot be understood in the framework of social mobility or Sanskritization a la M.N. Srinivas. It is better understood, I have suggested, in terms of the antisocial potentialities of the king untouchable pair. As an aside, in a strangely vicarious way, this came through very recently when Narendra Modi, who wears his backward caste status quite publicly on his sleeve and ceaselessly performs the dramatis persona of the celibate ascetic Hindu male, got his name proposed for election by the untouchable king, the Dome Raja of the cremation ghats of Varanasi. I'm sure all of you know this. By legend, the great and righteous king Harish Chandra, who has been further immortalized by both Bollywood cinema and plays in various Indian languages, the great and righteous king Harish Chandra had apprenticed himself to the untouchable Kallu Dome, who oversaw the burning of bodies on the riverside of Kashi and kept vigil over the sacred fire. Harish Chandra believed that insight into the human condition was to be found amongst those untouchables who administered death rites and mediated the path to moksha. Kalu Dome henceforth acquired the status of a king, and even today, the burning of bodies in the sacred city of Varanasi begins with a prayer to the Dome Raja, something that clearly Narendra Modi harked back to when he got himself proposed by the existing Dome Raja. Let me, in conclusion, return to the question of sovereignty. Historians from Sanjay Subramaniam to Wendy Doniger have noted that Arthashastra and Niti Shastra, the classical sciences of governance in South Asia, as well as the political narratives of the Mahabharata and the much translated Panchatantra, picked up by Persianate kings in later centuries, have always been agnostic towards the Brahmanical social constitution or dharma. That is indeed the case. But this does not imply that rulership in South Asia was or is in a relationship of sovereignty vis-a-vis society. On the contrary, I have argued that society in South Asia itself operates as a juridicalized formation, as a competing locus of power, relentlessly seeking to incorporate both kings and outsiders within its purview by ascribing to them a proper place in the Varna and Jati hierarchy. At times, political power would ride this incorporative social dynamic, such that the king himself would operate as a social actor par excellence, as did the Brahmin Peshwas, and Raja Krishna Chandra in 18th century Maharashtra and Bengal, respectively. Perhaps we see something like that in today's India, where the state seeks to make political identity and social identity, the nation and the Hindu, one and the same, allowing free play in its own name, in the name of the state itself, to punitive social forces, as when common citizens come together to lynch an ordinary Muslim, invoking the eminently social issue of culinary choice. But at other times, as we see in innumerable past instances, political power would push back against the incorporative social constitution, mobilizing a powerful antisocial perspective. This option, which we may call the option of exit, or the option to assert the right to be outside society, is lost to us moderns. Our vocabulary of majority and minority buys into the modern statist imagination of the dominant and the subaltern, arithmetically adding up to a single and seamless social aggregate, without surplus, spillage, or remainder. There is no political vocabulary left today for the antisocial, for the outsider, for the foreigner, for the ascetic, in so many words, as a locus of social critique. My attempt in this paper has been to try and recover this alternative asocial or antisocial location beyond the social constituencies of majorities or minorities by looking back into history. Thank you.